one of the big disputes that has been, going on the left over the last decade or so, more than a decade, has been, the character of both the Syrian regime, as the Syrian regime, this heroic anti-imperialist regime, part of the axis of resistance, fighting the forces of Zionism, American imperialism, and whatever. And then, obviously, within this narrative, you have leftists adopting the hardcore war on terror discourse, saying that the Assad regime is fighting an Islamist insurgent. It is, it's like Al Qaeda light. So let's talk about HTS and its kind of rebranding. So, I was on the Bunga Bunga podcast not so long ago, and the kind of analogy I have is like, you have this movement emerging in the Civil War, and they're kind of like, I guess, Trotskyists and Stalinists, right? You have the ISIS is like the Trotskyists. They're like, we're going to spread this Islamic revolution across the borders, like down with the nation state, down with Sykes-Picot. And then you have, you have HTS, which becomes more of a Syria-focused organization, even though their leader speaks Arabic with an Iraqi accent, which is how long he's been in Iraq for. So you have this kind of national Islamism, which moves, I wouldn't say it's the same as the AKP in Turkey. There's a very different sort of genealogy to this movement, but looks to that kind of technocratic Islamism as like a solution for the country, that we won't go full ISIS on everybody, but we're going to kind of try and create like optimal conditions for pious Muslims in our country, and also sort of engage in development. So can you talk a little bit about, how genuine that transformation is? We've gone from a kind of Al Qaeda now like seen as the moderates within the Islamic world, which would be unbelievable 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
Right. So obviously this is very heated and complicated, but going back to the beginning, Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the predecessor group to HTS, was founded by members of, at the time, what was the Islamic State of Iraq, that was the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Iraq. And they crossed the border. A lot of them were Syrian, like Jolani, Shara. And from there, they formed this group that was, they didn't publicize until a year or two later that they were an Al-Qaeda franchise, but that's what they were. So they were plugged into this transnational jihadi network. And then you have the Islamic State split, which I think at the time, Al-Qaeda didn't change its ideology. It was still very much a transnational movement. I think the thing that happened is, well, the Islamic State it was, very extreme and definitely put ideology over strategic vision. And so they basically declared war on everyone. And it worked for a minute because, the Iraqi state partially collapsed, the Syrian state partially collapsed. So they're able to seize this territory. But then, so that's its own thing. And then you go to Nusra and the relationship between Nusra and Al-Qaeda. And there, I think this developed over a series of years. Initially, Jolani had asked for permission, I think, from Al-Qaeda to distance himself. And eventually the split became more and more real. And now organizationally, they're not tied. And we've also seen since then, so this was back in 2016, over the course of the last 8 years, we've definitely seen shifts in how they approach both the international community, how they approach Syrians, and how they approach governments. And I think that the thing to emphasize really is that Jolani is a very pragmatic actor. And he was very intimately involved in the Iraqi jihad and in the Al-Qaeda and then Islamic State project. And I think, he's very aware at how sort of disastrous this lack of strategic vision was, and that how off-putting the extremism in terms of like hudud, like punishments, the, extreme implementation of Islamic law is. And so, you kind of, obviously you can't like get inside his head. So you don't know what is genuine and what is not. And what's clear, he's very ambitious, very pragmatic. So it's hard to say exactly what has changed, but all we can really go off is what the actions of Tahrir Sham, HTS, in the last 8 years and what they've said. Obviously, this is not good enough, but I don't know how you get better than that. So if you look at the governance of Idlib, they have changed their approach over the years. So Idlib has several minority populations. The majority of the population is Sunni Arab, but then there is a small Druze population and a small Christian population of various sects, some Armenians, some Orthodox Arab Christians. And early on in the war, when this part of Idlib was sort of overrun by these jihadi groups like the Islamic State and Nusra, speaking specifically about this, not we can get into the debates about the opposition and more broadly later or whatever. But I believe initially it was the Islamic State, which was calling itself Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. Then, this is before they declared the caliphate, they forcibly converted the Druze there, forcing them to become Sunni Muslims. A lot of the Druze left, but so you have this population of Druze there that was converted, and also a lot of the property was taken, and actually a lot of it ended up in the hands of Central Asian jihadis, the Uyghur population that's in Idlib, or the Uzbeks, Tajiks. So in the last several years, Jolani actually went, so that they didn't reconvert back to Druze, but Jolani did go through efforts to return property and to sort of lessen the repression. In terms of Christians, also lessen the repression on Christians in Idlib. So that's one thing that's pointed to in terms of the sort of ideological, moderation, which, I mean, yeah, you can say maybe that's tactical, but it happens, and that's not what we see from the Islamic State or from Al Qaeda, the Taliban, necessarily. And so that's something people point to. Also, just the system of governance definitely started, as you mentioned, the AKP in Turkey. You do see this technocratic Islamist government. I mean, I don't know if you can really compare it to the AKP, because the AKP is really based on the cement industry, and it's the Turkish cement industry that's making buildings and giving the cement to the Syrians in Idlib. But anyway, yeah, you see a change. I mean, the people compare it to the Taliban in the regard that they, have ditched the idea of transnational jihad and are very much localized and are trying to make friendly with the international community. And then I think the Hamas is another good comparison in terms of a group that sort of merges nationalism with Islamism. Though it's interesting because Hamas comes out of the Brotherhood movement, whereas HTS is actually coming sort of from the other way, from the transnational jihadi movement. But then now I think if we look at what's happened since they've taken over Damascus, the Idlib, what we saw in Idlib does not necessarily match what we've seen so far, though again, it's early. But Jolani does seem to be very mindful that Idlib is one thing. Like Idlib was always one of the more conservative Sunni majorities, almost entirely Sunni provinces within Syria, whereas now, Damascus is a very cosmopolitan, ethnically, or at least religiously diverse, liberal, whatever, city. And, you have the coast too, Tartus, Latakia. These are very different places from Idlib. And while there was reports, I think were mentioned in the beginning about, Islamic references within police training, they're very much, some things get floated or reported on, and then things get changed. And also the situation in general is in flux. So it's hard to really point to one thing. But that's kind of my convoluted way of saying that overall, I think there is definitely a genuine strategic divergence. And at this point, I mean, I think, there has been an ideological shift, and Jolani, I think, very much realizes sort of the disaster that was the jihadi movement of the last 20 years. And while the people saying he's a liberal or whatever, I think that's crazy. There's definitely, I think, real change in his vision.
So, in terms of that vision, what do you see with in terms of the policy stability of a move towards a more democratic system of government in Syria? As you mentioned, they had this kind of orchestrated event where Giuliani was kind of proclaimed the president by a variety of different kind of military factions, as opposed to kind of other civil society organizations or anything like that. So, what's the form of government that's going to come out of this? Will we have a kind of one-party state or some kind of de facto one-party state? Do you think elections are a realistic proposal at the moment? What kind of elections can take place in Syria with no civil society, or civil society that's been decimated by war, and these dominant kind of military factions, groups of armed men around the country?
So what we see right now, well, I guess going to the conference first. The conference, I think, the way it was reported, it wasn't necessarily clear that it was only military factions. And I think this was very much related to a series of meetings that the new Minister of Defense, who's an HTS commander, had with all these other factions, the factions from the south, the SNA, factions that were closer aligned to Tahrir Sham. That was sort of agreeing or sort of coercing them into accepting that this is the way things are now. We're going to have a centralized state with a centralized military. And so this was a way for, I think, those groups to acknowledge that and for it to be seen that there was sort of consensus on the opposition military side of things. And the commanders that spoke at that event, so he gave a speech, Giuliani gave a speech that it was sort of boilerplate about the event was actually called like the victory conference. So it was about the victory of the war of the opposition. And it was a very short speech. And then later a spokesperson listed a series of proclamations, and one was declaring him president. But you had other military commanders from some of the other groups speaking too. So that was sort of, I think, just about military consensus. And then since then, we've seen in terms of the cabinet, a lot of the cabinet's mostly figures from the previous HTS government, the Salvation government that ruled Idlib. And then the governors of the various provinces, not all of them have been appointed, but the ones that have, they're almost all HTS linked to some degree. So that's what you have now. And then recently in the last week, they have created a committee. So they've been talking about a supposed national dialogue conference for the last couple of months, ever since they took power, that will, they'll have dialogue. And then this will somehow lead to whatever the new structure of government will be related to a constitutional process. So this week we sort of got our first look at that, or at least we've seen now the preparatory committee, and that consists of 7 individuals. 2 of them are from HTS, or the Salvation government. 2 of them are from Islamist militias that were very close to HTS by the end of the war. One of them is from the Turkish-backed groups. He was a spokesman for them. And so those 5 are all men, all Sunni Arabs, all come from a conservative background. A lot of them have religious training. Some of them have worked as preachers before. And then you have 2 women that are on the committee as well. One is a Christian woman from a Damascene sort of liberal family, and she's a Canadian-Syrian dual citizen, has been living in Canada for the last 10 years, I think, and was involved in the sort of internationally recognized opposition political body that was negotiating in Geneva. Mm-hmm. And then was involved in various other civil society organizations, mostly based abroad or based in the opposition areas. And then the last member of this committee is a Sunni woman from Homs, the central Syria, who was involved in various aid and civil society ventures, and as far as I know, is not politically affiliated. anyone. So that's the committee that's now going to be facilitating this undated conference that's occurring at some point. And they've begun doing consultative visits around to different provinces where they've met with groups of like 100 to 400 locals. We don't really have, I mean, maybe some people might be able to recognize different figures in these provinces. Some of them, have sort of greater gender parity. Like if you're on the coast, the meetings they've had, there's definitely women present. But as like a province like Idlib, some of the pictures show there's barely any women there. But we don't, other than these pictures, we don't really know what, and the sort of vague statements, like what the makeup of these are. I think in a lot of cases, it's going to be sort of notables. You have religious figures. You'll see, like in some of these provinces, you'll see Christians, like priests at these meetings, or sheikhs, or prominent families, whatever. We don't really know. But they're supposed to be having conversations with each province, and then somehow they'll do workshops, and then they'll consult with the president, and then Shara Jolani, and then we will get to a constitutional process that's not been outlined yet. And HTS, for their part, or Jolani, has pretty consistently said that there will be elections. The timeline he's given is 3 to 4 years. But, all the details they've given are vague. So we really don't know exactly what shape things will take. And I'm not even sure if they do. Though I will say the way this consultation process goes definitely leaves a lot of room for them to be making decisions. And this committee doesn't actually have any authority. So that's definitely concerning. But I think people I talk to are generally, it depends who you talk to, but I think a concern more so than necessarily the ideological content is that power is going to be completely centralized within Jolani, Shara, and the HTS cadre.